The throne burned gold beneath me before I understood what I had done. And in that single heartbeat, my entire life split into before and after. I had wandered into the storm without intention, only grief. Evilise had been dead for 3 days when the blizzard came, and I walked into it the way a wounded animal seeks a cave, not caring whether I found shelter or simply disappeared into the white silence forever. The forest had always been more home to me than the village ever was, and if it chose to swallow me whole that night, I would not have fought it. I was 24 years old and utterly alone, the last keeper of knowledge no one wanted, the orphan raised by an old woman who whispered to plants and read fortunes in the patterns of frost on window panes. The cave found me. I did not find it. One moment I was stumbling through knee-deep snow, my cloak soaked through and my fingers numb beyond feeling. And the next moment the ground gave way beneath my boots, and I slid down a slope of frozen earth into darkness. I landed hard on stone. The wind knocked from my lungs, and when I finally managed to breathe again, I realized the storm had vanished. Above me, roots thick as my waist twisted across the ceiling like the fingers of a giant hand, and between them, pale light filtered down from somewhere I could not see. The air smelled of moss and something older, something that made my skin prickle with recognition I could not name. I crawled forward because I could not go back. The slope was too steep, too slick with ice, and my body was too exhausted to climb. So I moved deeper into the cave, following the strange light, and that is when I saw it. The throne. It sat in the center of a natural chamber, carved from stone so black it seemed to drink the light around it. Symbols covered every inch of its surface, spiraling patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like vines, almost like the branching of veins beneath skin. They pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat waiting to be matched. I told myself I only sat because my legs would no longer hold me. I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just a stone chair in a forgotten cave, that I would rest for a moment and then find another way out. But the moment my body touched that throne, I knew I had been lying to myself. The gold light erupted from the stone like dawn breaking through a winter sky, and it poured into me through my skin, my eyes, my open, gasping mouth. I felt it burning pathways through my blood, writing itself into my bones, and when I screamed, the sound that came out was not entirely my own voice. It was layered with something older, something that had been waiting in that throne for longer than I had been alive. Longer perhaps than my grandmother and her grandmother before her. When the light finally faded, I looked down at my arms and saw the marks. Golden lines traced my skin from wrist to shoulder, delicate as embroidery, intricate as frost patterns, and they glowed faintly even in the darkness of the cave. I touched them and felt warmth, felt power, felt a connection to something vast and ancient that stretched out from me in all directions like roots seeking water. I did not understand what had happened. I only knew that I was no longer simply Seraphina, the orphan herbal woman, the girl no one wanted. The wolves came then. I heard them before I saw them. The soft pad of massive paws on stone. The whisper of breath that was too deliberate to be merely animal. They emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, and my heart should have stopped with terror. But instead, it slowed, steadied, opened like a door that had always been waiting for the right key. The first was enormous, a male whose shoulders would have reached my chest if I stood beside him, his fur white as fresh snow, but streaked with silver gray along his spine and muzzle. His eyes were amber, liquid gold that held an intelligence so sharp it cut through every assumption I had ever made about the boundary between human and beast. Scars marked his face and flanks, old wounds that spoke of battles survived, of decades spent guarding something precious. He stopped a few feet from the throne and lowered his great head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and I heard his voice inside my mind as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. "You have come at last, Luna." I could not speak. I could only stare as the second wolf stepped forward, smaller than the male but no less striking. Her fur was pure white, unmarked by any scar, and her eyes held a gentleness that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She approached me slowly, carefully, as though I were a wild creature she did not wish to startle. And when she pressed her nose against my marked hand, I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the magic still humming in my veins. She was greeting me, welcoming me, telling me without words that I was not alone anymore and never would be again. These were the hybrids Evelise had whispered about in her final days, when fever clouded her eyes and loosened her tongue. Half wolf, half spirit, she had said, creatures born from an ancient pact between the forest and the women who served it. They carry pieces of human souls within them, fragments of those who died protecting this land. They are more than animals, child, and if you ever meet them, you must remember that they chose to be what they are. I had thought her delirious. I had been wrong about so many things. The male wolf, who I would come to know as Fenris, led me out of the cave through passages I never could have found alone. The female, Ivara, walked at my side, her shoulder brushing my hip, her presence a steady comfort in the disorienting darkness. We emerged into a world transformed by dawn. The storm passed, and the forest glittering with fresh snow that caught the early light like scattered diamonds. I stood there breathing cold, clean air into my lungs, feeling the marks on my skin pulse gently with each heartbeat, and I understood that I could never go back to the life I had known. The throne had claimed me. The wolves had found me. Whatever came next, I would face it as something more than I had been. The village learned of my transformation within days. I should have hidden, should have fled deeper into the forest and built a new life far from human eyes. But Ivara guided me back toward Evalise's cabin with an insistence I could not refuse. There were herbs there that the pack needed. Medicines Evelise had prepared for ailments that affected the hybrids differently than ordinary wolves. I thought I could slip in unseen, gather what I needed, and disappear before anyone noticed the golden marks that now covered my arms and climbed up my throat to trace my jawline. I was wrong. Brennan saw me first. He was a hunter, broad-shouldered and hard-eyed, a man whose hatred for wolves had calcified into something almost religious after his brother died in the forest 20 years ago. He saw the marks on my skin, and he saw Ivara waiting for me at the tree line, and his face twisted with a fury that made my stomach clench with fear. Witch, he called me. Wolf bride, abomination. He gathered men around him that same day, men who had always looked at me with suspicion and now had a reason to let that suspicion bloom into violence. They would hunt me, he declared to anyone who would listen. They would burn Evalise's cabin and salt the earth where it stood. They would kill every white wolf in the forest and end the old pact forever. Not everyone agreed with him. Torin, the ferryman's son who had taken over the village forge after his father's hands grew too twisted with age to hold a hammer, spoke against the hunt in the village square. I watched from the shadows of the forest, Ivara pressed against my leg, Fenris a silent sentinel somewhere in the trees behind me. Torin's voice carried clearly in the cold air, calm and measured where Brennan's had been hot with rage. He spoke of the old stories, the ones the elders still told around winter fires, stories of a time when the wolves protected the village from threats no human weapon could touch. He asked what proof they had that I meant any harm, what crime I had committed beyond surviving a storm and bearing marks no one understood. He asked them to wait, to learn, to remember that fear had driven good people to terrible acts before. Brennan called him a fool and a coward. The crowd shifted, murmured, split down lines I could almost see forming in the snow-trampled earth. Some stood with Brennan. Others drifted toward Torin. Most simply watched, uncertain which side would prove safer to join. I slipped away before anyone could spot me, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of terror and hope. Someone had spoken for me. Someone believed I might not be a monster. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I lived in the forest with the pack, learning to read their movements and understand their silent communications, discovering piece by piece what it meant to be the Luna they had waited for. Fenris taught me the boundaries of the territory, the places where the veil between the physical world and something deeper grew thin enough to whisper through. He showed me the ancient stones where offerings had once been left, the streams that carried healing properties only the marked could access, the dens where generations of hybrids had raised their young in secret. His mind touched mine with memories that were not my own, glimpses of Lunas who had come before me, women who had given their lives to maintain the balance between human settlement and wild sacred space. Ivara taught me something different. She stayed close when the weight of my new role threatened to crush me, when I woke gasping from dreams of golden fire and endless responsibility. She showed me how to find peace in small moments, the beauty of light filtering through ice-laden branches, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the warmth of pack members pressed together against the cold. She reminded me that I was still human, still Seraphina, still the girl who had grown up mixing poultices and learning the names of every plant that grew within walking distance of the village. The marks had changed me, but they had not erased me. I was both what I had been and something new, and learning to hold those two truths together was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Torin found me on a morning when the snow had begun to melt and the first brave green shoots were pushing through the forest floor. I was gathering spring herbs near a stream, my marked hands moving with practiced ease among the plants, when I heard footsteps that were too heavy to be a wolf's. I turned to find him standing at the edge of the clearing, his smith's hands empty and raised to show he carried no weapon. He had come looking for me, he said. He had questions he could not ask anyone else, and he hoped I would trust him enough to answer them. We talked for hours. I told him about Evilise, about the stories she had shared, and the secrets she had kept. I told him about the cave and the throne, about the burning golden light and the marks that had rewritten my skin. I told him about Fenris and Ivara, about the hybrid nature of the wolves, about the ancient pact that bound them to this forest, and the Lunas who served as bridge between their world and ours. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes thoughtful, his weathered face revealing nothing of judgment or fear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked the question I had been dreading. Why you? Why did the throne choose you? I did not know. That was the truth I had been avoiding, the mystery that gnawed at me in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Evilise had never told me who my parents were, only that I had been found at the base of the great oak on the spring equinox 24 years ago, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with symbols she recognized but would not explain. I had always assumed I was simply unwanted, abandoned by a mother too poor or too young or too frightened to keep me. But the throne had known my blood. The throne had been waiting for me specifically, for the child left beneath the oak, for the girl raised by the last woman who remembered the old ways. The answer to Torin's question was tangled somewhere in the past I had never been allowed to access, and finding it might be the only way to understand what I was truly meant to become. Brennan's hunt came with the full moon. I felt them enter the forest before I heard them, a disturbance in the web of connection that now linked me to every living thing within the territory. There were 12 of them, armed with bows and spears and torches that flickered orange against the silver-lit trees. Brennan led them with the certainty of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause, and I understood with terrible clarity that he would not stop until either I was dead or he was. The pack gathered around me in the clearing where the throne cave opened into the world above. Fenris stood at my right hand, his massive body coiled with readiness, his amber eyes fixed on the direction from which the hunters approached. Ivara pressed against my left leg, her white fur bristling, her breath coming in low growls that resonated in my chest like a second heartbeat. Behind us, others emerged from the shadows, Wolves I had only glimpsed in my weeks with the pack. Hybrids who had kept their distance until now, but who came without hesitation when their Luna faced true danger. There were 7 of them in total, 7 against 12. And I knew with sick certainty that if this became a battle, blood would soak the melting snow before dawn. I stepped forward before Fenris could stop me. The marks on my skin blazed gold in the moonlight, bright enough to make the nearest hunters stumble and shield their eyes. I called out to Brennan by name, my voice carrying with a resonance that was not entirely natural, a power the throne had given me that I was only beginning to understand. I told him that I did not want war. I told him that the wolves had protected this forest and the village beyond it for generations beyond counting, that the pact between our kinds had been broken only because humans forgot, not because the wolves ever failed in their duty. I told him about the threats that lurked in the deeper wilderness, things that Fenris had shown me in shared memory, creatures that would have swept through the village like plague if not for the hybrid guardians who held the boundary lines. I told him that killing me would not end the old magic, only leave it unguided, unpredictable, potentially dangerous in ways none of us could foresee. Brennan's answer was an arrow that sang through the air and buried itself in the ground at my feet. What happened next exists in my memory as fragments, bright and sharp as broken glass. Fenris leaping forward with a roar that shook snow from the branches overhead. Ivara darting between hunters with speed that seemed impossible, her teeth finding bowstrings and spear shafts, disarming rather than killing because I had begged her not to take human life if any other path existed. The other wolves engaging in a chaos of fur and torchlight, and my own voice rising in a command I did not consciously choose, words in a language I had never learned pouring from my throat with the force of absolute authority. Stop. The word hit the clearing like a physical blow. Every wolf froze. Every hunter froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The marks on my skin burned brighter than they ever had, gold fire racing along every line and spiral, and I felt the throne's power flowing through me in a torrent I could barely contain. I understood in that moment what the Lunas before me had been, not just bridges between worlds, but arbiters, peacekeepers, voices of a balance that predated human memory. The forest itself was watching through my eyes, judging through my judgment, waiting to see what choice I would make. I chose mercy. I walked between the frozen figures, wolf and human alike, and I stopped in front of Brennan with his bow still raised and his face twisted with hatred and fear. I reached out and touched his chest, directly over his heart, and I let him feel what I felt. The weight of centuries of guardianship, the price the wolves had paid to keep the darkness at bay, the grief of Fenris, who had lost pack members to human hunters even as he continued protecting human settlements, the hope of Ivara, who believed even now that coexistence was possible. I gave him everything, held nothing back, and watched his face crumble as the truth of what he had nearly destroyed washed over him. When I released the frozen moment, Brennan fell to his knees in the snow and wept. His hunters lowered their weapons one by one, bewildered and shaken, no longer certain what they had come to kill. I stood among them with my wolves at my back and offered them a choice. They could return to the village and speak of what they had learned, or they could stay and learn more. The forest would welcome those who came with open hearts. It would only fight those who brought violence. Torin emerged from the trees then, and I realized he had followed the hunters, had been waiting in the shadows to intervene if he could, to bear witness if he could not. He crossed to stand beside me, a human man who chose to ally himself with wolves and witches and ancient magic, and when he took my hand, I felt the last piece of something broken finally click into place. I had been alone my entire life, an orphan without history, a healer without community, a woman forever on the outside looking in. But standing in that clearing with moonlight streaming down and the pack at my back and a good man's hand in mine, I understood that belonging was not something given. It was something built, choice by choice, connection by connection, until the web grew strong enough to hold. The seasons turned. I rebuilt Evalise's cabin with Torin's help, expanding it into a proper hall where villagers could come for healing and where wolves could shelter when the winters grew too harsh. Brennan never became a friend, but he stopped being an enemy. His certainty shattered beyond reconstruction. His hatred melted into something closer to cautious respect. Others from the village followed Torin's example, venturing into the forest to learn, to trade, to remember the stories their grandparents had told them as children. The old pact was not restored, not exactly, but something new grew in its place, a fragile bridge between worlds that required constant tending, but that grew stronger with each crossing. I found the truth about my birth in the depths of the throne cave. In carvings, I could only read after months of practice, and a ritual Fenris guided me through on the winter solstice. My mother had been the last Luna before me, a woman who had fallen in love with a village man and hidden her pregnancy from both worlds, terrified of what her divided loyalties might mean for her child. She had died bringing me into the world, and her pack had placed me at the oak tree in hope that I would find my way back when the time was right. They had waited 24 years. Fenris had been my mother's closest guardian, had loved her as wolves love, completely and forever. And when he looked at me now, he saw her face echoed in mine. I was not an orphan. I had never been unwanted. I was the daughter of the forest itself, returned at last to claim my throne. The golden marks on my skin never faded. They were my inheritance, my responsibility, my connection to every Luna who had come before, and everyone who might come after. When I walked through the village now, people looked at me with wonder rather than fear, with hope rather than suspicion. When I ran with the pack under moonlight, Fenris at my side and Ivara racing ahead to scout the path, I felt a joy so complete it sometimes brought tears to my eyes. I had spent my whole life searching for home, and I had found it at last in the most unexpected of places, on a throne I sat upon by accident, in a cave I fell into during a storm, among wolves who were so much more than wolves. The forest whispered its approval through every leaf and branch and root. The throne pulsed warm and golden whenever I visited its chamber, and I, Seraphina, last daughter of an ancient line, Luna of the White Wolves, guardian of the sacred balance, finally knew exactly who I was meant to be.